I'm a speaker for Creation Ministries International out of our American office in Atlanta. We're actually in 7 different offices around the world. We have about 30 people like me on the speaking circuit. We present in a non-COVID year, about 12 or 1,300 churches and schools every year around the world. We are trying to support Scripture through science and trying to encourage Christians that they can believe the Bible, and that science doesn't prove the Bible wrong, and things like that. I have 2 presentations for you this morning. One of them is going to be more complicated than the other. This first one is going to be the simpler of the 2, but there are going to be a couple of places that are going to be a little sticky for some people, more like science-minded, like the nerdy me. So just hold on to your hats. If we get to the part where you say, I don't get what's going on, in a slide or 2, we'll get to something easier and simpler. The goal here is to open up a world of, even without full understanding, to point in a direction and say, look, here's where these answers lie, and here's where the scientists are going, and here's how DNA and genetics intersects with this question of races. I'm not going to deal with critical race theory. I'm not going to deal with Black Lives Matter. I'm not going to deal with anything political. I'm going to really try to stay far away from those things. But you know how they train government agents to spot counterfeit money? They get them to learn the real thing. Study it intently. Once you know it intently, you can spot the counterfeits. So what I'm going to try to do here is lay out a biblical perspective for how we should deal with races. And then when we engage other people, it's like, wait a minute, here's a biblical answer. So instead of fighting on the stuff people fight about, we just hold it. This is what the Bible says, and here's where we should be. Because if we understand where humanity is in relation to each other, that changes a lot. And the Bible says a lot of things about where we are in relation to one another, how closely related we are, and things like that. A lot of what I'm about to present has already been presented in Creation Magazine, which is on the back, in the back if you'd like to sign up for it. We also have a gigantic website called creation.com, which is full of amazing articles. We have a whole races question and answer session with, 50, 100 articles on races and racism, how we answer these things. And what I'm saying now, we've been saying for 45 years. I'm a 2nd-generation CMI scientist. The people who started this organization are now retiring. I can't believe I'm stepping into these gigantic shoes that they've made. But we've been saying the same things all these decades, and now science is starting to back up more of what we've always been saying. But we want to get to history. That's an issue. Because history and what we can do in the laboratory aren't the same thing. But in order to address the question of races, we have to get into where do we all come from. And that's a historical question. But history is fun. When I went to school, I had a hard time deciding on my major. I was either going to be a history major or a biology major. And I went to an engineering school. I don't know why. I just did. So I ended up with a degree in biology through an engineering school, and I ended up with a PhD in biology. But if you would look at my phone, which is here, and look at all the books I read, because I read constantly. Anytime I'm online or waiting for anything, I'm reading. And I'm almost always reading history. I love history. I love the human condition. I love thinking, if I was there, how would I react? I would probably been dead in that condition, but it's an amazing thought of our ancestry, where we came from. I often like to think, would my ancestors have liked me? Ooh, that's a hard question. Some pictures from my ancestry. That, you hardly can see it. That is the world's fanciest cruise ship lying on its side. 1942, Brooklyn Naval Yard. The SS Normandy was marooned here at the start of the war, and the United States government had bought it, and they're converting it into a troop transport to bring American soldiers over to England for the invasion of France, and it caught fire. But the French fire ports didn't fit the American fire hoses, so all they could do to put the fire out was to spray water from the fire ships on one side of the ship, and it rolled the ship. Now I show you that because my great-grandfather was on that ship when it caught fire. And he was horribly burned. Like, he had so much scar tissue, he couldn't work as a longshoreman anymore. He ended up being a New York City cab driver. My great aunt, the only thing she said, he was a mean old coot. Tough guy, big guy too, tough guy. Just down the road, literally, from here, drive a couple of miles east, you come to this beautiful row of brownstones. Some of the most iconic architecture in all of America. These are beautiful, these go for many millions of dollars. It's just a picturesque place. Well, I took that photograph because I had this photograph from my family history stack. That's my grandmother. Right there. Oh, not this one here. Let me put that laser pointer. That's it. That's my grandmother. That's her grandfather, Rinza van der Veen, who came from Friesland. This is his second wife, Martha Holm. That is the same porch. In fact, he built this row of brownstones. So I have in my family blue-collar workers and white-collar workers. And I don't know how those two branches of the family came together. But most of my family has been, poor working class, working hard, trying people throughout, as many generations I can go back. Here's another picture. Now, this is Torkel Torkelson. He was born in Norway in 1865. Immigrated to the United States, married a woman much younger than him. I think she was 16 and he was 25, 27, but whatever. That's Lizzie Gorman. She grew up in a slum on Manhattan, which is now billion-dollar buildings. But this was a prostitute, lice-infested, disgusting place to grow up. Her parents were Irish potato famine immigrants. They get married and they went to Jekyll Island, Georgia. Have you ever heard of the creature from Jekyll Island? That's the Federal Reserve. They were on the island, rubbing elbows. They were servants. He was a carpenter on the island with the richest people in the world when they hatched the plan for the Federal Reserve. In fact, my grandfather, who's here in the middle, this is Torkel Edwin Torkelson. His name, Edwin, is after Edwin Gould, the railroad tycoon, who was apparently a friend of the family, so they named their son after this guy. But my great-grandfather here died of tuberculosis. And Edwin and Norman on the side here, they're about to die of tuberculosis. This little girl was the second girl named Jenny in the census records, and she didn't make it to the next census. So after losing most of her family, my great-grandmother goes back to New York City and lives again, extremely poor, trying to make ends meet. Why am I showing you all this? Because history is amazing. Because where we came from is amazing. The story of humanity is unbelievably cool and fun. And if you were to give me all my nerdiness, and all my genealogy, and my love of geography, and Google Earth, well, I'm going to draw lines on the map of where all my people were born and where their kids were born. And so you can see all these lines, those are my people coming across to America. Okay, look at me. What area of the world do my ancestors come from? Not just Europe, Northern Europe. Is it that obvious that I come from Northern Europe? How can we do that? How can you look at a person and say, oh, I know where your ancestors came from on the geography of the whole world? Africa, China, Native America. I mean, how can you pick a person and say, and guess where their ancestry is, and you can often be very correct. We only have a few thousand years of biblical history. How do you get races from Noah's family? That's a good question, isn't it? Well, we can answer that. And we can answer that with the new field of genetics. Now, genetics is an old field, but DNA technology is new. We didn't have the ability to sequence genomes 20 years ago. The first one was sequenced, and now we have tens of thousands. Genetics has given us a tool set. Basically, genetics is the study of how traits are passed from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next. So in studying genetics, we can build models of history. Well, the Bible's a history book. Genetics gives us tools for studying history. Do we dare test the Bible using science? Yeah, we should. Carefully, but we definitely should. Now, just to lay down some groundwork here, I am a geneticist. I'm actually a marine biologist or a coral reef ecologist by training, but in the middle of my graduate work, I ended up in the genetics lab. And when I stole the green and red protein genes from these corals and engineered them into these fish, that's when I got my doctorate. So my doctorate's in genetic engineering of a sort. It's kind of fun. Yeah, so I made the frankenfish. But that opens up a giant can of worms. And that's another subject for another day. Biotechnology, genetic engineering, is it good, is it bad? Are we allowed to monkey around with God's creation? Those are honest questions that need to be answered, but not for today. I'm just trying to show that I am a geneticist. In fact, since then, I don't do gene sequencing or genetic manipulation anymore. What I do is I download databases onto my laptop here, and I crunch numbers. And I'm a total geek. I love running computer programs that analyze data sets. All right, to each his own, that's me. I published a paper a couple years ago. Have you ever heard of mitochondrial Eve? The one woman who's the ancestor of all people on Earth? Well, there is one woman who's the ancestor of all people on Earth. The evolutionists know this. They call her mitochondrial Eve. Well, they had never published mitochondrial Eve's sequence. So we did, the creationists did. And now it's out there. We know what mitochondrial Eve's genetic sequence was. You, of course, have heard of the flu, right? Remember the 2009-2010 swine flu epidemic, bird flu epidemic? Remember how many people died? No, you don't, because it disappeared from the news system. Because it was such a big poof. They dropped it. I don't know, OJ, I don't know what came after that. But it was oh, we're all going to die! And then they just stopped talking about it. Well, we realized that there was a database of influenza. And someone had dug up a woman who died in Alaska of the flu in 1918. And they had dug her up and sequenced the flu genome that had killed her. And we had a record now of the genetic legacy of this H1N1 virus from 1918 until 2012 when we published that paper. That's a long time. Genetic databases aren't like that. We don't have millions of human beings sequenced for thousands of years. That doesn't exist. But with influenza, we had literally thousands of influenza viral sequences, and we were able to count up the number of mutations that accumulated in the virus over time and test evolutionary theory with it, and evolutionary theory failed. Because the virus was picking up mutations constantly for about 100 years, and in 2009, it went extinct. And that big influenza pandemic in 2009, that was a replacement virus. It killed off the original virus, and it almost did nothing because the viruses had been so mutated by then, they weren't killing people. I'm hoping that's going to happen with COVID-19, but it's only been 2 years. 2 years is not 100 years. So we can wait for that one to see, but I expect that this virus is going to be accumulating mutations over time. It's going to get weaker and weaker and weaker. It's still killing people today, but give it 10 years. We'll see what happens. Okay, just establishing my credentials as a geneticist. I don't claim I know everything about genetics, but this is my world. All right, let's ask a biblical question. According to the scriptures, from Shem, Ham, and Japheth, from these three, all the peoples of the earth descended. Does that mean that everyone on earth comes from Shem, Ham, and Japheth only? Yes. That's a challenge, because there are 7.5 billion people in the world. I downloaded this from the U.S. Census website. It's a chart of population size going all the way back to claiming 10,000 BC. And strangely, that's odd, because the population just went. But if you look at this, there's actually almost no evidence at all for those early years. If there's maybe like 1 million people alive, I don't know what the population size was, let's just say 1 million people for thousands of years, the average lifespan might be 30 years. That means every 30 years there's another 1 million dead bodies. we're missing a couple of billion bodies. And we're talking about humans who, even, the evolutionists say, oh yeah, they had these primitive religious ideas and they were burying their dead. Well, if they're burying their dead, where are all bodies, Mr. Evolutionist? It's as if the time actually doesn't exist because the evidence for the bodies isn't there. But if you were just to take a simple model of population growth, let's say we start with 6 people, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their 3 wives. And let's say the population doubles every 150 years. That's really slow. I had 4 children. My wife and I doubled our population, from 2 to 4 in 1 generation. If you double the population every 150 years, you go from 6 people to 7.5 billion people in 4,500 years. That's the time since the flood. So the population growth curve beautifully fits biblical history with no struggle at all. In fact, we get to ask, how come there are only 7.5 billion people? Populations grow a lot faster than doubling every 150 years. That's crazy slow. They grow a lot faster than that. Well, warfare, disease, and starvation has kept the human population in check. It's easy to get more people than that, but because the world is difficult and people are so brutal, that's why we have fewer people. But again, it just fits, that's what it's going for. It fits the biblical timeline beautifully. All right, so we're not struggling with the number of people alive today, but people are different. We have black people, or Africans, we have Europeans, we have Chinese, or different looking types of people. Okay. And we have to fit that into a biblical timeline. What is the biblical timeline? How much time has there been? Well, I wrote an article called The Biblical Minimum and Maximum Age of the Earth. My co-author and I, we looked at all the places in the Bible that informed us on how old the Earth is. And we said, okay, from an engineering perspective, here's a number. That number is not like 1.0000000. It's 1 in a year. But if Seth is born when Adam is 130 years old, he's probably not born on Adam's birthday. He's born sometime during that year. So that number the Bible gives us is plus or minus 6 months. Oh, in fact, it's probably plus 6 months because it happens after Adam is 130 years old. It might be that it's in his 130th year, which means he's only 129 years old. That's a year difference right there. So every single time the Bible gives us a number, there's a little bit of wiggle. And when you add up all the numbers in the Bible, how much wiggle do you think you get? Can you think you get thousands of years of wiggle? The answer is about 200. So the Bible says the earth is a little more than 6,000 years old. I can't peg it to a specific day or a specific year. It's not, the accuracy of the numbers that's not the purpose to give us an absolute chronology of Earth's history. But it does give us a chronology, and the chronology is very tight, and that's what we get, about 6,000 years. Okay, I'm going to give you a bunch of numbers. I'm going to round them off to make them really easy. Creation is a little more than 6,000 years ago, 4,000 BC. The flood happens about 1,600 years later. Abraham lives about 2,000 BC. That's a nice number to know. That's a nice round number. Moses lives about 1,500 BC. Exodus is probably 1556. That's a nice number. David literally lives 1,000 BC. Of course, Jesus, at the turn of the ages there, year 0, there's no year 0, but I put it at 0. And today we're about 2000 AD. More context. Have you ever heard of the Bronze Age, the Iron Age? How long do those things last? That's an age. That sounds like a long time, right? Well, actually, they're a century or so, depending upon where you are. Some places skip over entire ages. Because if you're in the Copper Age and all of a sudden someone comes in with iron, you skip to the Iron Age. No Bronze Age at all. This whole system was developed only for the ancient Middle East, only. And it doesn't apply to other places. But even then, Moses lived in the Bronze Age. David lived in the Iron Age. Oh. These aren't ages at all. They're just technological innovations. In fact, in David's time, Solomon built massive pillars and a bronze sea and a bronze bowls. He's doing massive projects out of bronze late in the Iron Age. So these ages are it's really ambiguous. But just in context, the destruction of Troy was in the time of the Judges. The Peloponnesian Wars were during the time of divided monarchy. The famous 300, the Spartans that defended against Persia, that was Esther's king. Let's put it all in context here. Biblical history encompasses all of world history. There are some claims, like the Chinese emperors that predate the creation, but that's the 5 mythical rulers period. There's not really hard dates there. All right, so we're okay so far? Okay, we got genetics, we have history. Now let's look at some of what the scientists, the Christians, the theologians are saying on these issues about races. This is Dr. Francis Collins. He just retired as the Director of National Institutes of Health. This man ran the Human Genome Project. He claims to be an evangelical Christian. I'm not questioning that. But as an evangelical Christian, he claims he believes the Bible. Christianity Today ran an article called The Search for the Historical Adam. And they wrote this about Dr. Collins' book, in one of his books. Collins' 2006 bestseller, The Language of God. A scientist presents evidence for belief. Okay, hold it. You're about to hear a Christian present evidence for why he believes the Bible. What do you think you're going to hear? He reported scientific indications that anatomically modern humans emerged from primate ancestors perhaps 100,000 years ago, long before the Genesis time frame. Originally, the population had numbered something like 10,000, not 2 individuals. I'm confused. What are those numbers? What is that 100,000? What is that 10,000? What are those numbers? That is the standard evolutionary out of Africa theory of human origins, where they say we were reduced to a population of effectively about 10,000 people, which is a near extinction event. And somehow, during a very long time frame, a few 100,000 years ago, we evolved from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens. You know that adage, with friends like that?
Yeah.
He's at a conference at Pepperdine University talking about Adam and Eve and human genetic diversity. There's no way you can develop this level of variation between us from 1 or 2 ancestors. So he laid down the gauntlet there. He said Adam and Eve are impossible as an explanation for human genetic diversity. Ouch. Dennis Venema worked with Francis Collins and his organization called Biologos. And he said this on National Public Radio, trying to explain how much diversity is in humans. You have to postulate there's been this absolutely astronomical mutation rate that has produced all these new variants in an incredibly short period. These types of mutation rates are just not possible. It would mutate us out of existence. So here we have 2 geneticists, 2 scientists saying Adam and Eve are impossible scientifically. Ouch. Can we answer that? Do you know what their mistake is? What's their mistake? Well, first of all, they're assuming that God didn't engineer any genetic variation into Adam and Eve. Duh. Yeah, if all genetic variation has to arise through mutation, there are millions upon millions of genetic variants amongst the 7 billion people in the world. Then that rate would drive us extinct. That's true. But what if God orchestrated a few million variants into Adam? You, are any of you sisters? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You 6 people have 99% of the world's genetic diversity. You can do that with any people group on the planet. Most all of our variants are shared amongst all populations. There are some that appear in only some populations, but never 100% of the people in that population. But blue eyes only appears in a fraction of Europeans. Red hair, which I used to have, only appears in a fraction of Europeans, etc. But we share almost all our variation. If that variation didn't arise from mutation, it would have been on Noah's Ark. Therefore, it would have been in Adam and Eve. How much variation are we talking about? Well, there are about 30 million letters that vary in the human genome that are found worldwide. You carry 3 million of them yourself. In fact, it's not 30 million. Of the common variants, you carry about 1/3 of the world's genetic diversity by yourself. And if you, as an individual, can have 1/3 of the world's genetic diversity, triple that, and there's Adam. Now, we would have lost some at the flood because there's only one family that came through the flood. So maybe double that again. But the variants that are shared amongst us all, they don't cause disease. The common variants are neutral. The disease-causing variants are almost always rare. Those are the new ones. Those are the mutations. Those are the things that have arisen recently in human history because our genomes are falling apart. So blindness, all sorts of things you can think of. Sickle cell anemia. These are new mutations. So here's the challenge there. Adam has 2 of each chromosome, right? 2 chromosome 1s, 2 chromosome 2s. Remember that from biology class? So if Adam has, let's do this. Hold up, 2 pieces of paper. No, that's not. I'll just use my fingers. Here's 2 chromosomes. Chromosome 1 is 250 million letters long. And we read down through Adam's copies of chromosome 1. A, T, T, G, C, 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 A, G, 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 T. Oh, there's an A and a T. God could have engineered an A on one chromosome and a T on another, or a C on one chromosome and a G on another. Is that okay? That means that all the variation in Adam is at 50-50. Any variant found in Adam is half and half. Half for A, half for G, half for C, half for T. 50-50. Now, over time, as children are being born, if Adam has an A on one chromosome and T on another, it's not like half his children can get that A and half can get the G. It's random. So it might be that all the children get the A and the T is lost, or G is lost. But over time, that 50-50 in Adam should flatten out. Random changes, because you don't have a million children, you only have a few children. Therefore, probability tells us that your genes are going to fluctuate in frequency. Remember I said there's going to be some hard stuff and some easy stuff? Is this okay? The reason I say this is that when we look at genetic diversity in the world, you carry about 100 mutations that no one else in the world has. Everyone is born with brand new mutations because the little machines that copy DNA, they make mistakes. They're not perfect. They're amazing machines. They go like 1 million letters or 1 billion letters even before they make a single mistake. They have to copy about 6 billion letters of DNA every generation. That's a couple of mistakes. So every child born has mutations that no one else in the world has. If you add up all the mutations in this room, there are many millions of mutations, but they're incredibly rare. The frequency is 1 over 7.5 billion. They're very rare. So most of the variation in the human genome is piled up in the rare side. It's not at 50-50, it's over on the extremely rare end. This is the data from the 1,000 Genomes Project. This is chromosome 22. So I took about 2,000 chromosome 22s and I counted up the genetic variants and I looked at their frequencies and I drew this graph. You can see most of the data is off on the left, which is like in one person, in 10 people, in 100 people. There are very few genetic variants that are in 1,000 people, which would be about 50%. Very few. So we have to start with the 50-50 in Adam and spread it out into that. Ooh, that's ugly. That's one reason why Venema and Collins were saying you can't get this from Adam and Eve. So I accepted this challenge, and some friends of mine, we wrote a paper that we published in at the 8th International Conference on Creationism. We have this computer model. It's called Mendel's Accountant. It's the most sophisticated evolutionary modeling program in existence. It was written by creationists. specifically to test evolutionary theories. And it's very powerful. We modified this program so that we could do this. We took a population on the computer of about 10,000 people, and we let the population run for a very long time, many thousands of generations. And anytime a mutation appears, it appears in one person, and then it might, if that person happens to have a lot of children, it might slowly spread throughout the population, or it might be lost. So all mutations start off on that side, and slowly they creep this way, if they're lucky. And we got this blue curve. So the real data is the black curve. The model data is the blue curve. Wow, it really does look like chromosome 22 evolved. The data are very similar. What we see in the real world is very similar to what we saw on the computer. So we said, oh, this is very disappointing. But then we applied some more models. We said, okay, let's use an evolutionary Adam and Eve. Let's let this population evolve. And let's pick two people out of the population, kill off everybody else. We'll call them Adam and Eve. So an evolved Adam and Eve, if you would. And let's let it run for many thousands and more generations. And we said, okay, let's do another one. Let's take a biblical Adam and Eve, where we don't have any evolution. We have Adam and Eve with no genetic diversity. Let's have another one with Adam and Eve. Let God put into Adam and Eve a lot of genetic diversity. Let's do another one. Just because God created Adam and Eve with genomes in their cells, it doesn't mean their reproductive cells have the same genomes. God's not limited by that. Adam and Eve's children could have radically different genomes depending upon which reproductive cells were given to them, if God engineered extra diversity in there. Why not? So the amount of genetic diversity in the world depends upon how many children Adam and Eve would have had. That's interesting. Put all those models together, and we ran them. And it turns out that all of the alternative models are a better fit, including Adam starting at 50-50, because those alleles spread out over time. And then when you add a bunch of new mutations, you get the stuff piled up on the left side. All of the models are a better fit than the evolutionary model. So, challenge answered. Can you get that amount of genetic diversity starting with Adam and Eve? Absolutely. The math tells us that. Okay, we're good with that? Maybe? All right, let's go easy. It's a great story. On the left is Bill Coulter. He is an Australian Aboriginal. On the right is George Snow Wilson. You gotta be a white man to have that nickname, Snow. These guys became best friends during the Vietnam War. Later in life, Bill, on the left, developed kidney disease. He needed new kidneys. They searched around, they couldn't find a match. So his best friend said, hey, test me. Come on. No, test me. Turns out they were a perfect match. And he gave a kidney to his best friend. Wait a second. Think of the family histories here. The evolutionists tell us that the Aboriginal Australians arrived in Australia tens of thousands of years ago, and there's been no family links between the Europeans and the Australians for tens of thousands of years. How is it possible that that white guy, the European guy, gave a kidney to the Aboriginal? It's not just like the blood type has to match. They look at hundreds of genetic factors to make sure they match, and they were a match. How is this possible? What's a race? If we're so genetically similar that we can swap organs, there's no difference between us. All right, another easy question. What would Adam and Eve have looked like? Would they have been black? Would they have been Chinese? What would they have looked like? Well, I'll tell you what, that is not Eve. And that is not Adam. These two beautiful people are at the opposite ends of the color spectrum of humanity. Now, the woman does produce some melanin. So she produces some pheomelanin, which is the reddish pigment. But she produces almost no eumelanin, which is the brownish pigment. That boy produces as much eumelanin as the human body can possibly produce. Interesting. I do not believe that Adam and Eve would have looked like this, because if you take all this genetic information and put it into two people, you get a mixture or a blending. Now, I think the red hair is a mutation, because it only appears in people of Scottish and Irish descent. That's a subset of Europe. Europe is a subset of the world, so it looks like something that happened in the population after Babel. Because anything that was at Babel should be spread out across the world, which is the millions of variations that we all share. There are some that are unique to subpopulations. Let me show you a map here. This makes me a little uncomfortable. This was collected prior to World War II, and essentially all the anthropologists before World War II were racists in horrible ways. Mainly they were Europeans, and they thought they were superior to everybody else. But what they did was they went around the world, and they took this color scale on the bottom left there, and they looked at the skin here on a person. Because that's skin that doesn't ever see sunlight. That's your skin color. And then they made a map of all the skin colors of the world. Interesting. You, of course, have heard that dark skin is adaptive, right? Natural selection drives dark skin in Africa. Okay, how come it didn't drive dark skin in equatorial Americas? How come it didn't drive dark skin in equatorial Indonesia? Oh. Genetics have gotten into this now. We now know. I love that phrase, we now know. You know what that means? To a scientist, it means I was wrong yesterday. But they're not going to say that. No. They don't like to say wrong. We now know the genes that control dark skin in southern India, in Australia, in Melanesia, are the exact same letters found in Central Africa. That means the genes were in our population before we spread out. The genes that code for the lighter skin pigments down in southernmost Africa are the same exact genetic variants that occur in Egypt. In fact, if you looked at the genetics of ancient Africans, we don't have much ancient DNA from Africa because DNA doesn't do well in equatorial environments, but there are some highlands in Central Africa and some caves, and they found some old bones, and they sequenced the DNA out of them, and they said, wait a minute, this isn't the DNA of the Africans that live there today. In fact, if you went to Africa 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, before the Bantus, the Zulus were the classic Bantu group, before the Bantus spread out from Central Africa, Africans wouldn't have as dark skin as Africans have today. There was a population replacement across a massive portion of that continent just a few thousand years ago. In fact, if you went to Europe in ancient times, Europeans didn't have light skin. The earliest Europeans, all of them we found after the Neanderthals, the first new group of people that comes in, Neanderthals are also humans, we'll talk about that in a minute. The first new people that come in, they have dark skin and blue eyes. And then a group of farmers from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, they started migrating into Europe. They came up the Danube River, they came across the Mediterranean, and when those two prongs of invasion met in Germany, they were genetically distinct peoples. And they had light skin. And those groups merged. The dark-skinned original people, the Neanderthals that were there first, the people that moved in later, they merged. We're talking about people groups that are more racially different than Europeans today are from Chinese people. Merged to become Europeans. What's a race? Genetics, I can't define it anymore. We've destroyed the whole term. But if you were to take people and move them all into one place and let them all mix, white people would disappear. Blonde hair would disappear because those are recessive traits. Now you still get a blonde-haired or red-haired kid pop out occasionally, but they'd be very rare because the darker skin pigment genes dominate the lighter skin pigment genes. If you were to mix everyone together, I don't say it sounds racist here. Let's say it this way. Puerto Rico is one of the most racially diverse places on the planet. It is a big island in the Caribbean where the Spanish didn't kill off all the natives. And then they imported a bunch of African slaves. And Puerto Ricans today most of them have a mixture of Native American, European, and African ancestry. And most of them have brown hair, brown eyes, and very tan skin. So, exactly what would happen if you took all the racial features and put them into one people like Adam and Eve. So we've been saying for decades, Adam and Eve would have been brown hair, and brown skin, and brown eyes. Yeah, and genetics also now tells us that's true. But how do we get racist? Okay, so now we have everyone together. We got Adam and Eve, all this genetic variation. How do we get distinct people groups from that? The answer is inbreeding. Another article I wrote, Inbreeding and the Origin of Racism. I published in the Journal of Creation. All I did was take one family tree that I found in the Bible. It's a family tree of a patriarch named Terah, the father of Abraham and the father of Sarah. Abraham married his half-sister Sarah. They have Isaac, who gets double doses of Terah's DNA through both of his parents. It's as if they gave birth to their brother. Isaac marries his first cousin once removed and first cousin twice removed, Rachel, who's descended from both of his uncles and is related to both of his parents. Jacob, their son, marries Rachel and Leah, his first cousins, who are much closer than first cousins because they're all interrelated in multiple ways from this patriarch Terah. You know how you have half of each of your parents' DNA? You know that, right? So you have 25% of your grandparents' DNA, 12.5% of your great-grandparents, 6% of your great-great-grandparents. By the time you go this many generations down from Terah, the sons of Jacob, that's the 12 patriarchs of Israel, with Joseph and Benjamin and Reuben and Levi, all those guys in the Bible, that's on the bottom of this chart here. By the time you go that many generations, they should have about 3% of Terah's DNA. But because they would have inherited so many different lineages, they actually would end up with about 22% of Terah's DNA. And according to the laws of genetics, a lot of those sections of DNA, maybe half of it actually, all 12 brothers will have 2 identical copies. In fact, no genetic variation at all. It's Terah, 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 Terah throughout the entire. So if there's a gene in there that codes for height or weight or skin color or curliness of the hair or shape of the nose, you can literally be walking down the streets of some ancient village and go, oh, there's an Israelite. Because they're going to be distinct because of inbreeding. There's a recipe for inbreeding in the Bible. That is what's going to happen after the Tower of Babel. There was a small population on earth at the time, and God separated it into little bands of people and sent them away from each other. And I mean, most people in human history have married someone who's born maybe 5 miles away or less from where they were born. In fact, most people have married their cousin. Charles Darwin married his first cousin. All of her brothers and all of her sisters all married first cousins. First cousin marriage is extremely common in world history. One reason for that is it keeps money in the family. So a brother or sister will get together and say, hey, your son marries my daughter, and we can still live on the estate. So that's what happened in Darwin's family. The British Medical Service right now, they're laboring under a big problem. And that is the great majority of birth defects that they're having to pay for through the medical system are actually coming from the Muslim community through first cousin marriages. You're not supposed to marry your cousin anymore. But God didn't put a prohibition on that until the time of Moses, thousands of years after creation. We've already seen problems. I mean, Esau, he's got hair all over him. That's called the Wolfman gene. Wow, did he really have that? Leah had weak eyes. I don't know what that means. One of the giants, or one of the sons of the giants in David's time, he had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. It's called polydactyly. Scientists were studying polydactyly in the Amish community because it's very common in Amish. You don't often see it because it's a very easy farm technique for fixing polydactyly. It's true. Anyway, they were looking around the world for other people who have polydactyly, and they found a group of Australian Aborigines. And they started sequencing the genes, and they went, wait a minute, that's the same exact letter change in the same exact spot. The probability of that is really low. There's a lot of ways to mess up that gene that would cause polydactyly. In fact, there's probably multiple genes that would affect it. But the same exact letter? What? They said, oh, wait a minute. A Dutch ship ran aground in northwest Australia in the 1600s. Apparently one of the sailors survived. And the American Amish have a common ancestor with the native northwest Australian Aboriginals. You've no doubt heard of the Out of Africa event. They say that we evolved in Africa, then we spread out of Africa. But I want to take a different spin on this. Take their story. They're saying there's been a single dispersion of people across the planet with limited Y chromosome and mitochondrial diversity, traveling in small people groups. In fact, for them even, in the recent past, and it went through the Middle East. That's funny, because every single one of those is a direct prediction of the Tower of Babel account. That's exactly the pattern we predict in the Tower of Babel. Now, put the origin in Africa. I'll leave you to go to creation.com, look up, just type in out of Africa or African origins. That's several articles there, a lot of details. I do not believe for a second we came out of Africa, and I think they've discovered the pattern we would predict. They force it into Africa because they have to. Because if it's not in Africa, it sure sounds biblical. Just think. Something else in the Bible, Genesis chapter 2. The Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground, breathed into the nostrils the breath of life, the man became a living creature. That tells us there's no common ancestry between man and any other species. Period. It also tells us there's only one human race. Likewise, women. As I say, we got 5 more minutes. Wow. About halfway done. People often struggle with the concept that we started with just 2 people, and there were no other people, and nothing else contributed to the human race. One of the escape mechanisms that old earthers have used over the years is just considering, oh, maybe we evolved and then God took Homo erectus and put a spirit in him and called them Adam and Eve. Or maybe there were people outside the garden. That's where you get white people in the garden versus not white people outside the gardens. The thing is, if you actually look at biblical history, I wrote this article, how old was Cain when he killed Abel? That's a very interesting question. Because the next time statements in the Bible after creation is Adam is 130 years old when his Seth is born. We don't know when Cain and Abel were born, but in a 130-year window, Cain and Abel could have been great-great-grandparents by this point in time. There could have been many people on earth, so therefore when Cain is worried about, whoever sees me is going to kill me, he's not talking about other people that God created, or of all people, or Homo erectus, or whatever. No, he's talking about his cousins. Now, Joshua Slomodas is a troubler of Israel. Now, he's an evolutionist, Christian, in the basics, he's a Christian. He's very aggressively anti-young earth creation. He wrote this book called The Genealogical Adam and Eve, where he's insisting that Adam and Eve weren't the only people on earth. And that's probably the harshest review of anything I've ever written. Genealogical Adam and Eve on creation.com. There's so much more. I'm going to show that and that and that. Okay, I'm going to skip over this, which is just a historical analysis of the Y chromosome. I'm going to skip over the mitochondria. And let's get to here. This is talking about racism. I haven't spent much time on that. Have you ever heard that there are 3 races of people? The Negroid, the Caucasoid, and the Mongoloid. Get those words out of your head. Not only are they abjectly racist, but they're not true. Okay, do you have the words out of your head now? Using a cursory reading of the Bible, one might conclude that there should be 3 groups of people: the sons of Japheth, the sons of Shem, and the sons of Ham. Now, this is totally wrong, but you might get that conclusion. One reason this is wrong is because if you look at... Where'd my map go? There's the map again. Okay. If you look at where the sons of Shem, Ham, and Japheth went, they lived on top of each other. Yeah, a couple of sons of Ham went to Africa, but Canaan didn't. We get the phrase Canaan land, or the promised land, we now call it Israel. That's the descendants of Ham. Other descendants of Ham lived in Arabia, some of them lived up in Turkey, and descendants of Japheth lived in Turkey, and descendants of Shem lived in Turkey, and the Anatolian farmers look like the ancestors of the Europeans. So the Europeans are descended from Shem, Ham, and Japheth. In fact, all people in the world should be descended from all 6, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and their 3 wives. Because you've got at least 5 generations between the flood and the Tower of Babel when people are spread out. In those 5 generations, there's no prohibition about marrying between families. So the sons of Ham are going to marry the daughters of Japheth, and you get a complete blending of everything. There's not 3 races. Out of our minds, it's not true. Worse, looking at genetics. I belong to Y chromosome group R1b. It's very common in Western Europe. About 80% of Western European men belong to this group. So my Irish great-great-great-grandfather, William Thomas Carter, he was R1b. And we can see in a map where it's found. It's really cool. Wait a minute. My group is in Central Africa. People with the darkest skin on the planet are closer related to me? In fact, I could be more closely related to someone from Cameroon than my great-great-great-great-grandfather's next-door neighbor in Ireland, who might belong to a totally different group on the family tree. What is a race? Looking at these groups, so I'm backing up here, trying to go back, even though I skipped it, I'm going to unskip it. Anyway, this is my group here, R1b. You see how all these branches go back to a single common ancestor not that long ago? That means I'm closely related to men from Africa. Other Irish men might belong to these groups I and J, which are from the total opposite side of the family tree. Yeah, the concept of race has been destroyed. People don't know that, but we need to tell them that. We can also now factor Neanderthal into the family tree because Neanderthals are fully human. No doubt about it, their DNA tells us it's human. All right, to the end. I'm going to read a couple quotes here. This should make you angry. Charles Darwin writing The Descent of Man. At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized race of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. What he meant was that the Europeans are going to kill off the blacks and the browns. At the same time, the anthropological apes will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for intervening between man and the more civilized state, which meant himself, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. For him, for humanity to progress evolutionarily, you have to get rid of the more defective branches of humanity. Louis Quintana-Mercy is a geneticist. He says, I'm going to use a big word here, phenotypic. It's the way you look. The genes that explain the phenotypic differences between populations, or the way the different races look, represent only a tiny part of our genome, confirming once again the concept of race from a genetic standpoint has been abolished. Why can't we understand that in America? Science has eclipsed the culture. Certainly has eclipsed Charles Darwin. Look at Colossians 3:11. Here there's not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave free, but Christ is all and in all. In Jesus there are no racial divisions. Thank God, because I'm not Jewish. A Redeemer will come to Zion, to those in Jacob who turns from transgression, declares the Lord. What, a Redeemer? Yeah, that's the same word used in the book of Ruth. Under Jewish law, if you owed a debt, Naomi owed a debt, she wanted her land back, but she spent all the money. A relative could step into your place and pay your debt for you. Now, he got Ruth in the deal. That was a nice deal for him, right? Boaz, way to go, Boaz. But Naomi owed a debt she couldn't pay. We owe a debt we can't pay. The debt is eternal death. That's the penalty for sin, and we cannot escape it except we've been given a way of escape, and that is our Kinsman Redeemer. Kinsman, hold on a second. I'm not Jewish. How is Jesus my kinsman? Well, he's related to me through Adam. Thus it is written in 1 Corinthians 15:45. Well, before that, repeat in 1 Corinthians 15:45. The first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. With the result that now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one and broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility. Amen. Now that dividing wall specifically is the dividing wall between Jews and Gentiles. Have you ever considered where the gospel went first? Outside of Israel, where's the first place, the first distance place we know the gospel went? Give you a hint. Philip, an Ethiopian eunuch who was on his way to Ethiopia. It got to Africa a long time before it got to Europe. The gospel transcends culture. It transcends our concept of race. It transcends everything we think about human history. The gospel applies to all of the descendants of Adam. We are all equally descended from Adam. The same amount of time between us and Adam for all people on the planet. We're also all equally sinful and all equally fallen. Have white people done bad things to black people? Yeah. Did black people do bad things to white people? When white people got to Africa? Yeah. There's not a race, a culture group on the planet that doesn't have blood on their hands. None. I look at what my ancestors did in European history, I'm disgusted. Those people are wicked. They were as brutal and vicious and mean as you can imagine. I mean, their history is horrible. But that's true of all people. We are all in need of a Savior. We are all in need of a Redeemer. We are all evil at our cores. As we talk to people about race and racism, we put those things in context, and some things can be diffused. Yeah, you're right, brother. Yep, that's all happened. But you know what? We're all evil. Now, some people don't want to hear that because they want to justify themselves, but there's a neutralization here thing. A thing we can use to neutralize. Again, a lot more on creation.com, a lot more on Creation Magazine. There's tons of articles on our website, books that address this, but each of my talks I'm going to use this verse. I'm going to end with this. 1 Peter 3:15. In your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that's in you. They do it with gentleness and respect. And my hope is in my Savior, Jesus Christ. And as a white man, I was hopeless till my kinsman Redeemer, who's distant related to me, but still related to me through our mutual ancestor Adam, came to save